Good afternoon. Welcome to The Analyst. Today we'll be taking up 7 newspaper articles from the Hindu and the Indian Express and discussing them. The handout for the same will be available in the description of this video for your kind perusal. Please have a look at that. The first article that we'll take up is related to India's role through its relations with China and USA in shaping the global pecking order. As the External Affairs Minister Jaishankar observed that the global political and economic hierarchy has undergone a significant change and now no single power can dominate anymore. The second article is related to the cotton yields and the policy imperatives for cotton in India, as the cotton yields have been declining and the cotton farmers are struggling to get the MSP for their crop. Additionally, we'll take up 5 articles in the simplified section which will be helpful for your prelims and mains preparation. The first article is related to the role of India in shaping the global order as well as the regional order in Asia. As the External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar observed that the global economic and political hierarchy has changed significantly. Now no single power can dominate anymore. So we will discuss the role that India can play in shaping the regional order in Asia as well as the global order through our relations with China as well as relations with USA. So we will discuss the fault lines between the India-US relations, the pillars of engagement between India and USA, and even more important than that is the areas of convergence between India and China and the core drivers of rivalry between India and China that may shape the upcoming regional order as well as the global order. This is important in GS2 under the topic international relations. First, let's discuss the more important pillar of this shaping of the global order, that is the India-China ties. The India-China ties can significantly influence the upcoming regional order in Asia, and even for shaping the global order, it may have a greater impact than the India-US relations in the long run. That is why the External Affairs Minister says that India has a special China problem. As compared to the problem that the world has with China, India has a special problem because we have a large neighbor next door. It is very significant because the two countries together, they account for almost 40% of the world's population. One is the world's second largest economy, that is China. Another is the world's soon to be third largest economy. Therefore, the relation has both the convergence as well as the estrangement. Engagement as well as estrangement with respect to China go hand in hand. Therefore, the two countries, they compete with each other. For example, competing for creating spheres of influence, competing for getting leadership in the upcoming multipolar order. Because India does not want to be seen as a pawn in the China-US rivalry. India wants to become an independent pole in the upcoming multipolar world. But the West has certain misconceptions with respect to the India-China relations. Let's look at the misconceptions of the West first. First, the West, especially the US, views India as a reliable, aligned bulwark against China, that they can use India as a pawn against China. But this is limited. India's alignment with the West will remain limited because of two factors. The first one is India has an inclination, India has an ideological preference towards strategic autonomy. Rather than being aligned towards a major power, we will remain strategically autonomous. The second limiting factor will be the pragmatic factor, that we have a practical economic dependence upon China. For example, the imports from China, and in the upcoming supply chains also, India will become an important cog in the supply chains, and the de-risking of the supply chains also from the China, that India is seen as a primary beneficiary of the de-risking. That is, the supply chains moving them away from China, the West sees that India will be the primary benefactor. But rather, as the global supply chains are diversified, India may become rather more dependent upon China because India will again be getting inputs as raw materials from China only. For example, the pharmaceutical products, renewable energy raw materials, etc. Similarly, the West sees the border dispute between India and China as one of the causes of tensions, as the primary cause of tension between India and China. Whereas it is a symptom. The border dispute between India and China, it is a symptom of a broader geopolitical rivalry. It is not the sole cause. This view that it is the primary cause, it got reinforcement through the June 2020 border clashes, the Galwan Valley clashes. It reinforced the view that border dispute is one of the major regions of tension between India and China. But the October 2024 border agreement, that was a move, a step in the right direction, establishing the guardrails which should not be touched. But the underlying fault lines, they remain. The risk of the border skirmishes in the future also, that remains. Although a large scale conflict may be averted because of the interdependence, the economic interdependence especially between the two countries, but there is an evidence why this border dispute is only a symptom, not the sole cause. For example, China has settled the land borders with 14 of its neighbors except India and Bhutan. Therefore, it may not be the sole cause, rather the political cause is there. For example, the McMahon Line. China accepts the border with respect to Myanmar through the McMahon Line, but with respect to India, it rejects the McMahon Line, saying that it is a colonial legacy. Therefore, the dispute is rather political in nature and the rivalry is rather broadly geopolitical rather than the border dispute being the sole cause. But there are certain areas of convergence also. These are also often overlooked by the West. For example, India and China, they have similar worldviews, although in limited areas. For example, both respect sovereignty and the non-interference. Both call themselves as the civilizational states. Both view themselves as the civilizational states and the leaders of the global south. And both seek equitable distribution of power in the global governance. Although there is a slight distinction here also, that India seeks an equitable distribution of power regionally also, that within Asia also there should be a multipolar order and globally also there should be a multipolar order, whereas China has slightly different stand. With respect to world only, globally only, it seeks a multipolar order without mentioning Asia, that we'll again look at. Also, there is another distinction, that India's approach is usually non-Western, that India does not want to take a hard stance. Its approach is rather benign in nature, whereas China goes for a direct anti-Western stance. Now let's observe the core drivers of rivalry between India and China. The first driver that is often seen is the sovereignty and territorial integrity. Both countries have concerns with respect to each other. For example, the Chinese concern is with respect to Tibet. Tibet was annexed by China in 1951 and India officially recognizes Tibet as a part of China. But we can leverage that anytime in future also, because for example, Dalai Lama resides in India and the succession may become a major flashpoint. The succession of the 89-year-old Dalai Lama. Dalai Lama has openly said that my successor will come from the free world, not from China. Whereas Beijing claims a veto over it, therefore it can become a flashpoint. The concern of India is with respect to Kashmir, because Kashmir is an integral part of India and will remain an integral part of India. But China has violated our territorial integrity, for example, by laying claims upon the Aksai Chin and the Eastern Ladakh. Also, even the relation with Pakistan has violated our territorial integrity. For example, Pakistan ceded the Shaksgam Valley to China in 1963. Similarly, the construction of the China-Pakistan economic corridor that passes through the Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, therefore violating our territorial integrity. The next driver of rivalry is the asymmetry of status between the two countries, between India and China. One is the material asymmetry, material imbalance that you will observe. Second is the perceptual asymmetry, the asymmetry in the perceptions. The material asymmetry you can observe through the difference between the GDPs, for example. You can observe this through the graph also, that China's GDP is 5 times larger than India's GDP. Similarly, China's defense budget is 3 times larger than India's. And in the foreseeable future also, this gap, we may even see it widening even further. So therefore, there is a material asymmetry between the two countries. In terms of perceptions also, there is asymmetry. For example, China has remained unwilling to recognize India as a peer, as an equal, even when the economy sizes of the two countries were almost similar in the past. And this unwillingness to recognize, this has created security dilemmas in India because of the trust deficit. And similarly, China views India as a pawn in the US-China rivalry rather than looking at India as an equal partner or an equal player. And various scholars also have similar perspectives. For example, Rajiv Sikri observes that China sees India through the US rivalry prism. China ignores bilateral issues, and other scholars they observe that China sees India not as a rival or global power, rather India is seen as an irritant in siding with the US. But India is not an appendage to the US. India is an equal player when it is dealing with either USA or with China. Similarly, in the China also there are perspectives from their scholars. For example, they question India's stance, India's claim that India is the Vishwa Guru, the world teacher. They often deride it, make deriding remarks saying that what will India teach to the world? Another evidence of asymmetry that you will find is with respect to the diplomats. For example, out of the past 14 foreign secretaries of India, 6 of them were either foreign ambassadors to China or had roles assigned to them dedicated to China. A number equal in parity with respect to USA. That is how much importance that India accords to China with respect to the foreign relations. Whereas if you look at China, out of their past 5 foreign ministers, none of them had roles assigned dedicated for India. Rather, all of them had either roles assigned specifically to the USA or to the G7 nations. Another rivalry is with respect to the public perception and the trust deficit. For example, the public view in India is that China is seen as the greatest military threat for India. As per a 2023 Pew survey, two-thirds of the Indians had adverse feelings with respect to China. They considered China like an adversary. Similarly, an ORF survey in 2023 observed that 80% of the Indians believed that there was a dip in the relations, a dip in the ties between India and China after the Galwan Valley clashes. Similarly, there has been an entrenched trust deficit as well. For example, for India, there were low points in 1951 when Tibet was annexed, and then the 1962 India-China war directly, which caused trust deficit in India with respect to China. And China had always made deriding remarks with respect to India. For example, even calling Nehru as a running dog of imperialism in 1949, and it always viewed India as a pawn of USA. Another driver of rivalry is the economic interdependence as well. For example, there is a trade imbalance with respect to India and China. The Chinese exports to India are more than $100 billion, whereas India's exports to China are just about $15 billion. On top of it, China also imposes the non-tariff barriers upon imports from India. Therefore, India has registered one of the largest number of anti-dumping cases against China. More than 300 anti-dumping cases registered by India against China in the past 3 decades, out of which 30 were registered in 2024 alone. Similarly, the Indian dependence upon China is a necessity also. For example, we can look at various sectors like pharmaceuticals. India supplies about 50% of the generic drugs which are imported into USA. But India is sourcing more than 40% of our active pharmaceutical ingredients from China. Therefore, our dependence for the pharmaceutical sector upon China is significant. Similarly, for the renewable energy also, we are importing the raw material for that. And even after the 2020 bans on Chinese apps, for example TikTok, WeChat, etc., and the restrictions on the Chinese FDI, the FDI has remained significant from China. Similarly, even the economic survey 2023-2024 observed that to boost Indian manufacturing, it is inevitable that India plugs itself into the China's supply chain. Therefore, our dependence upon China is recognized formally as well. Now, what has been the government approach regarding this? The government has treaded cautiously, going for the case-by-case approvals along with conditions. For example, ensuring that the Chinese have the minority stake, not the majority stake with respect to investments. Similarly, the focus has been upon the strategic objectives like attracting the investments which can bring in technology transfer into India, which can boost manufacturing in India. Now, let's look at the challenges in the India-China relations that may inhibit the ties from shaping the global order. The first challenge is that the visions for the regional and global order for the two countries are competing. For example, India's vision is to establish both a multipolar regional order and a multipolar global order, whereas China's vision is the same with respect to the global order. They also want a multipolar global order, but regionally they want a Sinocentric, a China-centric regional order. This can be observed through the outcome of the October 2024 BRICS summit. The Indian readout from the BRICS summit mentioned both a multipolar Asia and a multipolar world, whereas the Chinese readout from the BRICS summit only mentioned a multipolar world. There was no mention of Asia. It gives an indication that regionally they want a China-centric regional order. The second challenge is that there is a mutual non-recognition of the civilizational status of the two countries. India lays a natural claim that India is the true middle of the East, that India is the natural leader of Asia. These words echo the Nehruvian words as well. Similarly, even the former Foreign Secretary Sham Saran observed that the China's claims to historical centrality in Asia have to be rejected, because this is imagined history on part of China, that this is imagined history that they are historically central to Asia, through which they want to legitimize their hegemony. It is not the real history. Similarly, the China also lays claims to the civilizational status, promoting its civilization through the Global Civilization Initiative. There was even a brief rhetoric in between, the brief cooperative rhetoric between the two countries. For example, Prime Minister Manmohan Singh in 2009 observed that there is ample space for both India and China in Asia. But this rhetoric was soon drowned in the din, outweighed because of the competition between the two countries. Another challenge arises because of the real manifestation of these conflicts. The manifestation, for example, both countries block each other in the regional and global forums. For example, India opposes the China-led initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative because it affects our territorial integrity and sovereignty. India also took itself out of the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, that involved the ASEAN countries, because India was afraid that if we are also part of the RCEP, our market may be flooded with the Chinese goods. Similarly, our engagement with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization has been also relatively low. For example, the absence of the top leader in the 2024 summit. Similarly, China has also been in opposition to India's global aspirations, like opposing India's permanent membership in the United Nations Security Council, opposing India's membership of the Nuclear Suppliers Group, the NSG, etc. Now let's also observe a couple of other areas where there are divergences in the approaches of India and China. For example, the non-intervention. Like we can see in the case of Israel and Gaza, China has been more vocal in its criticism of Israel's actions in Gaza as compared to India. Similarly, when it comes to Ukraine, China has been more vocal in its support for Russia rather than India. Another area is with respect to the right to development versus the green energy transition, the climate change, tackling of climate change. India has been more open to international collaboration for the technology transfers which can promote the green transition, whereas China has already become a dominant player in the green technology supply chains. Although both countries have a convergent viewpoint with regard to the usage of the hydrocarbons, usage of coal, for example, the phasing down of coal rather than the phasing out of coal because of the developmental needs of the developing countries. Similarly, both countries emphasize upon the responsibilities of the developed economies, the common but differentiated responsibilities, and also the opposition to the green protectionism. Also, with respect to the freedom of navigation, both the countries oppose the innocent passage of military vessels through their exclusive economic zones. Although with respect to the settlement of disputes, India has rather supported the peaceful settlement of the maritime territorial disputes. Now let's observe how India-US relations will shape the global order. First, let's look at the pillars of engagement between India and USA. The first pillar is due to the shared democratic values. The narrative of the natural allies between India and USA is there because the relationship is seen to be based upon the affinity between the world's oldest democracy and the world's largest democracy. But there are divergences in the application of these democratic principles. For example, USA utilizes democracy promotion as a foreign policy tool. It appreciates, it goes for critical appraisal of the democratic transition of the other countries. For example, the remarks regarding the change in Bangladesh in 2024. whereas India prefers the sovereignty and non-intervention over the principle. For example, the concerns regarding the change in Bangladesh again in 2024, and rather the non-interference is preferred rather than imposition of democracy in the other countries by India. Another pillar of the engagement is the strategic counterbalance to China. Here there is an area of convergence, but there are strict limits also. For example, the convergence is there with respect to the China concerns, that India can serve as a bulwark, as a counterbalance to China, and therefore there are enhanced cooperation areas between India and USA. For example, the defense cooperations, the cooperation through the multilaterals, for example Quad. But there is a strict limit to this strategic counterbalance also, and that limit is that India will retain its strategic autonomy. India will not enter into the formal alliance with anyone, rather follow its age-old policy of engaging with all the major powers. Also, India has a practical constraint also. That constraint is we are economically reliant on China because of the trade imbalance as well as the imports from China, and we are having military reliance upon Russia because of the imports of the defense. And the third pillar is the India is seen as an engine of global growth and the alternative to the supply chain, which may become heavily dependent upon China in the future. Now, the perspective of USA is that the Indian democracy is far more preferable for the friendshoring, that is de-risking of the supply chains from them being heavily dependent upon China and taking the supply chains away from China. Because India is a large market, India is having a significant population as well as the economic size which is growing, and the Indian ambition is that we want to become a trusted global manufacturing hub. But there are structural divergences as well, and there is a difference between the hype and the reality. For example, the manufacturing share of the GDP in India is stalled at just about 17%. And there are reforms needed to address the structural challenges. For example, the infrastructure building, the implementation of labor laws, and the sentiment that India is protectionist in nature. We need to change that as well. Now, what are the fault lines and the recent frictions between India and USA which may affect the global order? The first one is that India has adopted an assertive stance in its foreign policy now. For example, India seeks recognition. India seeks recognition as a responsible for global power as well as a civilizational state. For example, during the G20 summit, we proposed Indian solutions when we were having the G20 presidency. Therefore, India is asserting its identity as well as a civilizational status. The second is the allegations of the extraterritorial actions by India. For example, the allegations of the Indian complicity, Indian involvement in the alleged assassination plots in USA and Canada in 2023. And because of the US actions, India had to challenge that. Also, there is a fundamental mismatch in the policy as well. For example, the US philosophy is to enter into alliances and to enforce a liberal international order, whereas the Indian philosophy is aligned towards maintaining our strategic autonomy and ensuring that we retain our leadership with respect to the global south and we have the solidarity with the global south. Also, the presidency of Trump has had a transactional approach so far. For example, we can see the frictions with respect to trade. There is a trade imbalance with respect to India-US trade, and therefore President Trump went on imposing tariffs upon India. First the 25% tariffs and then another 25% as penalty for India buying oil from Russia. Similarly, even trying to hijack the narratives, like President Trump claiming that US brokered the ceasefire between India and Pakistan despite India repeatedly denying it. Similarly, there has been a past rhetoric from Trump. For example, he has made deriding remarks against India, calling India as an abuser of global trade. He even called the Indian economy as a dead economy. And there is another problem, that if the two leaders, for example, the Prime Minister Modi and President Trump, they have a similar worldview. If both become protectionist in nature, then rather than creating a synergy, it can become a source of tension as well because of the similarity in the worldviews. So what has been the Indian response to the friction and what can be the future trajectory? First, we have reaffirmed our strategic autonomy. For example, we have diversified the foreign policy and we retain that diversification. For example, the continuous engagement with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the BRICS, etc. And also going for the economic diversification so that we do not become entirely dependent upon USA. For example, pursuing the free trade agreements with other countries like the FTA with the European Union, we are pursuing that and trying to strengthen the domestic demand as well as internationalizing the Indian rupee so that we have reduced dependence upon the US dollar. At the same time, we have ensured that there is diplomatic caution that we are observing. We are not going for direct retaliation. We have retaliated neither in tariffs nor in public criticism because we do not want the relations between India and USA to nosedive to such levels from which they cannot be salvaged. Similarly, there has been a continued enmeshment between India and USA. For example, the 10-year defense agreement, the Indus-X Trust, Quad, Mineral Security Partnership, Artemis Accords, etc. So the path forward should be based upon mutual realism, and if there is an open acknowledgement between the two countries of the engagement limits, it will be better for both. And at the same time, the Indian strategy has to be proactive to enhance the strategic indispensability of India while reducing the vulnerability of India to the USA. That will help us in shaping the global order and becoming a leader in both the regional order and the global order. There is a mains practice question also. The trajectory of India's ties with the US and China highlights the complex strategic choices confronting the Indian foreign policy. Examine how the evolution of these relationships can shape the emerging global order. Please try to write it. The next article is related to the cotton yields and the policy imperatives for cotton in India. The context behind it is that the cotton farmers, they are struggling to get the MSP for their crop as the norms of the Cotton Corporation of India are not met. On top of it, the yields of the cotton are also low in India as compared to the global average. So we will discuss the challenges that the farmers of cotton face in India, the initiatives taken up by the government to promote cotton, and also the policy imperatives that can promote the growth of cotton in India. This is important in GS3 under the topic major crops and cropping patterns in various parts of the country. First, let's discuss a few basics regarding cotton. What are the growing conditions for cotton? It requires hot and sunny climate and long frost-free periods about 2-10 days for the growth of cotton, and it requires medium temperatures from 21 to 30 degrees Celsius and a rainfall from 50 to 75 centimeters. What kind of soils does cotton require for its growth? The ideal one will be the Deccan Plateau black cotton soil, but it can also be grown reasonably well on the deep alluvial soils in the North India, black clay soils in Central India, and also the mixed black and red soils in the South India. Now it is also sensitive to salinity, although it can tolerate some salinity, but it will be vulnerable to waterlogging. It is usually grown as a kharif crop and it requires 6 to 8 months for the maturing of the crop. Now what are the challenges that are faced by the farmers in the growth of cotton? The first challenge is the affecting of the cotton crop by the pink bollworm pest. It has reduced the cotton yields to 35% in the states of Gujarat, Punjab, Haryana and Rajasthan. It has led to unpredictable yields. The yields have come down. For example, the yield in India on an average is just about 450 kg per hectare as compared to the global average, and also in Brazil the yield is as high as 1800 to 2000 kg per hectare. Also there is limited irrigation. The cotton crop is grown usually in the drought prone areas, in the monsoon fed areas, which again leads to lower yields, and the declining soil fertility also leads to the decline in the yield of the cotton crop, as the Indian Council for Agricultural Research has also observed. And there is erratic weather at the same time because of the climate change induced unexpected droughts as well as excessive rainfall. Plus there are price discrepancies also. For example, in India, the cost of production of cotton is close to 9,000 rupees per quintal. The MSP is just about 7,235 rupees per quintal. Whereas the open market prices, they are even lower, less than 6,000, and at times hovering around 5,000 to 5,500 rupees only per quintal. Plus, there are traditional farming methods which are adopted by the farmers of cotton in India, because most of the cotton crop is grown by the small scale farmers. Therefore, they are not able to utilize the economy of scale. They are not able to invest in the machinery because it requires high capital investment initially. Therefore, they are not able to access the modern technologies. And about two-thirds of the cotton in India is grown in the areas which are seeking the water from the rain-fed cultivation only, and there is limited irrigation. Now, what are the government initiatives taken up so far for promoting the growth of cotton in India? First, there is the Cotton Development Program. It comes under the National Food Security Mission and implemented through the Department of Agriculture. There is the establishment of the Cotton Corporation of India. What does it do? It stabilizes the prices of cotton when the market rates fall. There is the MSP formula to fix the MSP at 1.5 times the production cost. Similarly, there is the establishment of the Textile Advisory Group. It coordinates among all the stakeholders to ensure that all the productivity, pricing and branding can be taken up. The launch of the Coat Ally mobile app was done to disseminate the information regarding the MSP rates and also the information regarding the establishment of procurement centers. The committee was set up on the cotton promotion and consumption, which recommends for a steady cotton supply to the textile industry. Now, what are the policy imperatives that we can suggest for promoting the growth of cotton in India, countering the low cotton yields in India? First, there can be further investments on the research and development. For example, addressing the pest challenges by developing new varieties, by ensuring that the diverse agroclimatic needs are addressed for each region. There are specific strategies so that the regional yield gaps can be bridged. We can go for genetically modified crop developments. They can offer us solutions as they will be able to address the economic losses. For example, the pink bollworm annual loss is about 3,900 crores as per the ICAR estimate. The production of the cotton bales in India has declined from an all-time high in 2013 of 360 lakh bales to about just 294 lakh bales in 2025. And out of this fall, about 47 lakh bales were lost only due to the climate change and the soil health deterioration as per the estimates of Indian Council of Agricultural Research itself. Also, we can promote the high density planting system. It can be promoted in the low productivity areas where we can combine the short duration compact BT cotton hybrids as well. It has led to about 30 to 40% productivity increases, and the BT varieties can be adopted to address the higher seed cost barrier. At the same time, we can also provide for stringent intellectual property protection also for the private sector so that a shift can be incentivized from the hybrids to various varieties developed. Another aspect where we can go for the policy imperative is informed policy discourse should be there on the genetically modified technology and the adoption of the GM crops. For that, the decisions have to be based upon the past experience, evidence-based decision making, open and transparent policy on the GM cotton. For example, we need to change the narrative. The narrative should not be to outrightly reject all the genetically modified crops, especially the genetically modified cotton. And also, rather than going for unscientific comparisons, rather than going for unreasonable international comparisons, we can go for a disaggregated approach. We can compare specific Indian regions. For example, if you want to compare the regions in India, we can compare Gujarat with Brazil. We can compare Rajasthan with Australia because the land parcels are similar, the climatic conditions are similar, therefore the yields can be compared region wise, specifically using a disaggregated approach. Similarly, we can go for the identification and the championing of the top performing farmers and therefore the replication of the best practices and also rewarding the best practices. Another aspect can be giving more support for the cotton farmers. For example, giving them cultivation incentives like the states of Punjab and Haryana are giving. They are incentivizing the shift from the cultivation of the water intensive paddy because it is bringing down the groundwater table in Punjab and Haryana. They are incentivizing the growth of cotton in Punjab and Haryana. Similarly, the promotion of the cotton growth in the dryland regions, for example, Gujarat, Maharashtra, Madhya Pradesh, etc., and ensuring that there is market stability as well as profitability. Therefore, the institutional models can be taken up for scaling them. For example, the China went for the functional farm consolidation via village level farmer cooperatives. India can also explore a similar approach, ensuring that the economies of scale can also be utilized by bringing together the farmers of cotton by building their cooperatives as well. We can go for further technology adoption and extension. For example, the targeted deployment should be there. The deployment of strategies should be agroecological zone wise. For example, the ICAR district efficiency classification. We can go for the integrated agronomic improvements like the adoption of the integrated pest management as well as the high density planting systems. They will be helpful in filling the productivity gaps. And the awareness also needs to be spread along with the education of the cotton farmers and giving them financial support, like giving them subsidies, for example the subsidized seeds, cheaper seeds, to alleviate the initial investment burdens. There is a means practice question also. Cotton cultivation in India faces multiple challenges ranging from agronomic and climatic constraints to market and policy related issues. Discuss the major challenges confronting the cotton sector and suggest the policy imperatives for ensuring sustainable cotton production in India. Please try to write it. The next article is related to the Sanjay Dobri, Ratapani, Panna and the Rajaji Tiger Reserves. This is important in GS3 under the topic Environment Conservation. Before coming to the article, let's discuss a few facts regarding these tiger reserves. First, the Sanjay Dobri Tiger Reserve. It is located in the Siddhi district of Madhya Pradesh and it is bordered by the Guru Ghasidas National Park on the south. It comprises of the Sanjay National Park and the Dobri Sanctuary, and it has a wildlife corridor connecting the Bandhavgarh and the Palmau Tiger Reserves. The rivers passing through the Sanjay Dobri Tiger Reserve are Banas, Gopad, Mawai, Mahan, Kodmar and Umrari. The flora here comprises of the North Indian moist, dry deciduous, peninsular sal, and the fauna includes tiger, sloth bear, cheetal, nilgai, chinkara, sambar, leopard, dhol, that is wild dog, jungle cat, hyena, porcupine, jackal, fox, Indian wolf, Indian python, four-horned antelope and parking deer. Next is the Ratapani Tiger Reserve. It is located in the Raisen and the Sehor districts in Madhya Pradesh and it is located on the Vindhyan Hills. It runs parallel on the northern side of the Narmada River and the Kola River forms its western boundary. The Bhimbetka, that is the rock shelters and the rock paintings, are also in the Ratapani Tiger Reserve. They are the World Heritage Site recognized by the UNESCO. And the Tiger Reserve also includes the Ginorgarh Fort, the prisoner of war camp, the Keri Mahadev and the Ratapani Dam as well as the Jholiapur Dam. The flora here comprises of both the dry deciduous and the moist deciduous forests, and more than 50% of the area in the Tiger Reserve is covered by teak forests. The fauna here comprises of tigers, chinkara, panther, hyena, jackal, Indian fox, wild dog, jungle cat, small Indian civet, blue bull, chinkara, black buck, chosinga, spotted deer and barking deer. The next is the Panna Tiger Reserve. It is located again in the Vindhyan ranges and it is the only tiger reserve in the entire Bundelkhand region, and it is located in the biogeographic zones of the Deccan Peninsula and the Central Highlands, and it is having a tabletop topography. That the tiger reserve, it has extensive plateaus and the gorges as well. The river passing through the Panna Tiger Reserve is the Kane River from the south to the north, and it also has 2000-year-old rock paintings. There are a few tribes residing in the Panna Tiger Reserve, including mainly the Baiga and the Gond tribes. The flora here comprises of the dry deciduous forest plus the grasslands and also the teak forest. The fauna in the Panna Tiger Reserve include the tiger, sloth bear, leopard, striped hyena, jackal, wolf, wild dog, jungle cat and the rusty spotted cat. Next is the Rajaji Tiger Reserve. It is located in Uttarakhand in the districts of Haridwar, Dehradun and Podi Garhwal. It is located near the foothills of the Shivalik ranges, and it is named after the famous freedom fighter C. Rajagopalachari, and it is located in the transition zone between the temperate western Himalaya and the central Himalaya. Therefore, it is rich in the biodiversity. The flora here ranges from semi-evergreen forest to the deciduous forest, and also from mixed broad-leaved to the terai grasslands, and therefore the forest type it categorized as the Indus-Ganges monsoon forest type. The main trees here comprise of the Rohini, Palash, Shisham, Sal, Khair, Arjun and Baas. The fauna in the Rajaji Tiger Reserve include the tiger, Asian elephants, leopard, jungle cat, Himalayan black bear, sloth bear, striped hyena, goral, sambar, wild pig, spotted deer, barking deer, and it also has lot of butterflies and the varieties of small birds as well. Now coming to the article, the National Board for Wildlife has approved 3 projects in different tiger habitats in Madhya Pradesh across the Greater Panna landscape, Sanjay Dubri Tiger Reserve and the Ratapani Tiger Reserve, besides a ropeway project as well in the core zone of Uttarakhand's Rajaji National Park. The next article is related to the electoral trusts. They are being used as a route for the funding for political parties. This is important in GS2 under the topic Salient Features of the Representation of Peoples Act. Before coming to the article, let's discuss the facts regarding the electoral trusts. They are non-profit organizations. They are serving as the intermediaries. They are collecting the voluntary contributions from the donors, from the individuals, from the companies, etc. And then they are pooling the contributions and then distributing them to the political parties. Now, who can set up the electoral trust? The companies can set up the electoral trust. The companies registered under Section 25 of the Companies Act, they can seek the approval for the formation of an electoral trust. And under Section 13B of the Income Tax Act 1961, the tax benefits are given to the donors also. The Election Commission of India regulates the electoral trusts, unlike the electoral bonds which are run through the banks themselves. And the electoral trust schemes was floated by the Ministry of Finance in 2013. Now, who can donate for the electoral trust? Any Indian citizen, any domestic companies who have been registered in India, and the donors, they are required to disclose their identity and also the amount that they are contributing. Now, there are certain entities who cannot donate. For example, the foreign companies or the foreign individuals, they cannot donate in the electoral trust. The government companies also cannot donate in the electoral trust, and other entities which are prohibited under the Representation of Peoples Act 1951. For example, the establishments which are receiving the foreign funds, they also cannot donate for the electoral trust. Now, there are certain issues with respect to the electoral trust as a route for the political funding. The first issue is the concerns regarding the transparency. For example, the donors' names, they are disclosed when they are donating for the electoral trust, but the amounts that are given to each political party, they are not available publicly. Second, the corporate influence is large, that the large donors, they are dominating the major donations to the electoral trust, and therefore it leads to an undue political influence. And there is an inequitable distribution also. For example, significant portions are given to the ruling parties or the major political parties, whereas very few contributions are channeled to the smaller political parties. There is a lack of donor diversity also, because there is a limited number of large corporations who are accounting for the major chunk of the donations to the electoral trusts. Now, the electoral trusts, they are having certain benefits over the electoral bonds. For example, the transparency is better in the donations in the electoral trust rather than the electoral bonds which were outlawed by the Supreme Court. In the electoral trust, the names have to be disclosed, and also the amounts received by the electoral trust, they have to be disclosed to the Election Commission of India. Whereas in the electoral bonds, there were anonymous donations which were allowed. There is more accountability of the political parties through the electoral trust. For example, there is a disclosure of the contributions which is dispersed to the political parties, as the public also knows how much has been received by which political party. Also, there is better regulatory oversight with respect to the electoral trust rather than the electoral bonds. For example, the electoral trust, they are governed by the Electoral Trust Scheme 2013, and the operations are also monitored by the Election Commission of India. Whereas regarding the electoral bonds, they were managed by the banks and there was little transparency regarding their regulatory scrutiny. Also, regarding the foreign influence, it is prevented better in the electoral trust. For example, the electoral trust, they prohibit the foreign donations, the foreign individuals or foreign companies or the entities receiving foreign funds, they are prohibited from donating to the electoral trust. Whereas in the electoral bonds, there was no direct prohibition. For example, the foreign controlled entities which were registered in India, they could give donations for the electoral bonds, whereas it is not allowed in the case of electoral trusts. Now, coming to the article, we can observe that the major contributions were channeled through three electoral trusts in 2024-2025, that is Prudent Electoral Trust, Progressive Electoral Trust and the New Democratic Electoral Trust. And the maximum donations were cornered by the ruling party. We can observe that the total donations that the ruling party received were more than 10 times that of the donations which were channeled to Congress. The next article is related to the rewiring of the macrophage metabolism for the treatment of tuberculosis. This is important in GS3 under the topic Science and Technology Developments and their Applications. Before coming to the article, let's discuss a few basics regarding the macrophages. The macrophages, they are a type of white blood cells. They are often called the big eater cells as they can ingest the pathogens, they can ingest the cancer cells, microscopic debris as well, and they are then destroyed, degraded and recycled with harsh chemicals and enzymes. But these macrophages, they sometimes fail to destroy the ingested pathogens, and these pathogens which were ingested by the macrophages, they can replicate inside the macrophage and they can hide from the other immune responses. Therefore, they also play a large role in controlling the inflammation and their malfunction, the malfunction of the macrophages, it can impact the inflammatory diseases. Now, where are they located? The macrophages, they develop in the bone marrow as monocytes. Now, these circulate in the bloodstream and then they settle down in the other body tissues also, and they are given different names depending upon the type of tissue where they are found. For example, the macrophages in the central nervous system are called the microglia, and in the bones, the macrophages are called the osteoclasts. Now, coming to the article, the bacteria that causes tuberculosis, that is Mycobacterium bacteria, that can also enter into the macrophages, that can also affect the macrophages. Now, the bacteria, if it has entered the macrophages, then it can create a niche there and persist there for months or even years altogether. Now, there are another ways of outsmarting the bacteria. Rather than going for the development of a new antibiotic, why don't we rewire the metabolism of the host macrophage itself? For example, the macrophages, they are ingesting the microbes, they are ingesting the bacteria, then they are killing it. They utilize various ways of killing it. For example, one of the ways is to create oxidative stress, the bursts of oxidative stress in the form of unstable molecules that can damage the cellular components. Now, the bacteria that has the greater ability to counter the oxidative stress, it will survive for longer periods of time in the macrophage rather than the bacteria which cannot withstand the oxidative stress and which has weaker defenses. Now, the study has pointed out that the macrophages, if they are relying upon the oxidative phosphorylation, a process through which they are trying to kill the bacteria, then the bacteria is likely to survive for longer and the periods of treatment will be longer. Whereas the immune cells, the macrophages, if they are using glycolysis, then the chances of killing the bacteria is higher and the bacteria will be easier to kill with the standard TB drugs themselves. Therefore, rather than inventing a new drug, we can go for the other ways of rewiring of the metabolism of the macrophages themselves. Therefore, the researchers, they found a motion sickness drug that has helped the standard TB drugs to improve the lung recovery in the mice. Now, let's also have a look at some facts regarding the multi-drug resistant TB treatment regimen, which was introduced in India for the 75,000 drug-resistant TB patients. It has been proven to be safe, more effective and a quicker treatment regimen as compared to the previous MDR treatment procedure, and it has also brought down the treatment time to just about 6 months from the previous 18 to 24 months, and the traditional treatment that also led to severe side effects. Now this treatment regimen comprises of 4 drugs: bedaquiline, pretomanid, linezolid and moxifloxacin, and it targets the TB elimination by 2025, 5 years ahead of the global target under the Sustainable Development Goals, and will be able to harness our large TB laboratory network comprising of the rapid molecular testing facilities and culture and drug susceptibility testing facilities as well. And this will be cheaper for both the health systems as well as the patients. The next article is related to the Food Safety and Standards Authority of India. This is important in GS2 under the topic statutory, regulatory and various quasi-judicial bodies. Before coming to the article, let's discuss a few basics regarding the Food Safety and Standards Authority of India. It is an autonomous body and functions under the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare and derives its powers through the Food Safety and Standards Act 2006. What does it do? It sets the food standards, regulates the manufacture, storage, distribution, sale and import of food, and ensuring the availability of safe and wholesome food for human consumption. Therefore, it even distributes licenses for the food vendors, etc. What are its core functions? First, the standards development. It ensures that there is safety in the food for the human consumption, and the development of the food safety management systems. For that, it develops guidelines for the businesses to implement the food safety practices, food safety management systems, and it provides licensing and registration for the food businesses, food carts, food vendors and restaurants, etc. And it also goes for surveillance and monitoring as well. For example, the FSSAI officials, they conduct the inspections and audits to assess the compliance regarding the food safety guidelines. It also spreads consumer awareness by educating the public about food safety, hygiene and nutrition. It also imposes the food import controls if there are harmful ingredients, therefore ensuring that the imported food contains no harmful ingredients. And it also provides accreditation for the food testing laboratories in India. There are a few initiatives taken up by the Food Safety and Standards Authority of India. For example, the Eat Right India movement, that is the promotion of the safe, healthy and the wholesome food consumption for all the citizens. The RUCO initiatives, that is repurpose used cooking oil, that is for the collection and the conversion of the used cooking oil into biodiesel. Also the FOSTAC initiative, that is food safety training and certification, that is a program to train the food handlers and to improve the hygiene practices. The initiative of Diet for Life, it is an awareness campaign about the metabolic disorders and healthy eating practices, promotion of healthy eating and healthy foods. Now coming to the article, the FSAI has observed that the eggs available in the country, they are safe for human consumption, and the claims that have linked the eggs to cancer risk, they are misleading and they are scientifically unsupported. The FSSAI has clarified that the use of nitrofurans, it is strictly prohibited at all stages of the production of poultry and eggs under the Food Safety and Standards Toxin and Residues Regulations 2011. An extraneous maximum residual limit of 1 mcg, 1 microgram per kilogram, has been prescribed for nitrofuran metabolites solely for the regulatory enforcement purposes, because this limit represents the minimum level that can be reliably detected by the advanced laboratory methods, and this does not indicate that the substance is permitted for use below these limits. The detection of trace residues below this limit does not constitute a food safety violation, nor does it imply any health risk, because there is an absence of such a scientific conclusion. The next article is related to the child marriage, the situation globally and the situation in India, and the actions that have been taken to end the child marriages in India. This is important in GS2 under the topic governance, and also in GS1 under the topic population and associated issues. First, let's look at the global scenario regarding the child marriages. The Sustainable Development Goal 5 aims for ensuring gender equality. Specifically, the SDG 5.3 aims for the elimination of the child marriage, early marriage and the forced marriages. The progress of the child marriage, ending of the child marriage, is measured by determining the percentage of women aged from 20 to 24 years who are married before 18 years of age. As per the observations of the Girls Note Brides, the failure of achieving the elimination of child marriage will negatively impact at least 9 other sustainable development goals, including the SDGs on poverty, health, education, and climate action. As per the UNICEF 2023 data, about 640 million girls globally were married in the childhood itself, and one third of the world's child brides are in India itself. So India accounts for a disproportionately large burden of the child marriages, early marriages. The global progress therefore must accelerate 20 times faster to meet the 2030 target. Now let's look at the situation in India also. In 2005-6 there were about 47% child marriages, and it was brought down to 23.3% by 2019-2021, but the progress has slowed recently. For example, there has been a sharp decline of 21% in the decade from 2005 to 2015, but only 3.5% decline was observed in the next 5 years. Also, the decline in the child marriages has been uneven across the states. For example, there are states which are having the rates of child marriages higher than the national average. The national average was about 23% in 2019 to 2021. The states with rates higher include West Bengal, Bihar, Tripura, Jharkhand, Andhra Pradesh, and Assam. And the states and UTs with the lowest rates include the Lakshadweep, Jammu and Kashmir, Ladakh, Himachal Pradesh, Goa, Nagaland. There is also a strong correlation which is observed with the child marriages and the education and wealth. For example, 48% of the girls with no education were married before they attained 18 years of age, as compared to just about 4% with the girls who had attained higher education. Also, 40% of the girls from the poorest wealth quintile were married before they attained 18 years of age, as compared to just about 8% of the child marriages in the girls who were coming from the richest quintile. Now, what are the actions that have been taken up till now for preventing child marriages in India? With respect to legislations, there are two legislations. The Prevention of Child Marriage Act 2006, which directly targets the child marriages, and also the POCSO Act, which indirectly targets the child marriages. The awareness campaigns have been taken up. For example, the Bal Vivah Mukt Bharat Abhiyan. Through that, the 54,000 child marriage prevention officers have been appointed nationwide, and also the 1500 reported instances were prevented via persuasion and administrative action. Also, the campaign has taken up grassroots partnerships with the faith leaders, with youth groups, and also community networks to target the child marriages. There are central schemes also, the Beti Bachao Beti Padhao initiative to improve the child sex ratio and also to empower the girls through education. The Ladli schemes, they provide the financial support to the families with the girl children from the birth itself. There are various states initiatives also. For example, West Bengal's Kanya Shri scheme, which provides conditional cash transfer, that is 1,000 every year and 25,000 as a lump sum amount when the girl attains 18 years of age. Now, another debate is regarding the changing of the legal age of marriage, as the Union government has proposed increasing the legal age of marriage for the girls also from 18 years to 21 years, bringing it at par with the legally marriageable age for the men. Now, what its stated aims are: it may be able to enable higher education, gain skills by the women, independence of the women, increase female labor force participation, improve maternal and child health outcomes, but there are certain concerns with this. First, without concurrent social reform, if the marriageable age for the girls is increased to 21 years, it may end up criminalizing a large section of the society. And also, 61% of the women aged from 20 to 24 years in India married before the age of 21. Therefore, it can lead to large criminalizations. Thank you.